As designers, there's never been more tools and technology available to help us to draw and share our ideas. And even with all of these advances, sketching is still a really important part of my design process. For me, sketching is not so much about the process of drawing, it's about the process of thinking. It's the tool that I use to map out information, to think through problems, and to structure my ideas. And when you start to think about sketching in that way, you can see why I believe it's a skill that every creative and designer should have and should be working on getting better at every day. I always start my projects by sketching, but when I say that, I don't mean trying to jump in and start drawing or designing end solutions. I describe my process of sketching as visual thinking. It's a way to map out information and just visually explore ideas. Sometimes it just ends up being scribbling out some notes or a really basic sort of site analysis, or even just some simple diagrams to test some ideas. But for me, it's a really important way to pull together all the information on a project, start to structure my own thoughts, and establish those first principles that will act as the sort of foundation or structure around which the design will evolve. It always ends up being quite rough, and it's more about the thinking than the drawing. But for me, it's a really important part of my design process. So what I wanted to do is just show, I guess, the typical sketch design process that I go through in the early phases of my projects. This is a current project that I'm working on, and we're doing a design for a new residential neighbourhood. And for me, the first step is always to map out the known knowns, the key issues and opportunities, and set up the first principles for the structure around which the design will evolve. So for this particular site, there's a main road which runs along the east and defines the eastern boundary to the property. Over towards the west, there's this existing housing and it views into the area that we're designing. So we've got to be really conscious of that. In terms of natural site features, the site sort of starts at a high point over here, which slopes down towards the south. And along the southern boundary, there's this creek and bushland environment, which is really quite beautiful and is going to create a really nice setting for the residential area that we're designing. By the time we get down to this lower point, it sort of flattens out in the area that we're going to be focusing on. There's also this existing stand of mature trees, which is, again, really quite beautiful. And I'm going to be incorporating that as part of the design. There's a man-made drainage corridor or swale through here, but again, it's really quite nicely done and it links down into the creek. So that starts to set up the possibility of having some type of linear open space that runs along this edge, creates a visual buffer or setting for this existing residential, but then ties in and creates an open space network which can potentially link together future areas of residential or residential neighbourhoods. The area that we're focusing on for the residential neighbourhood first up is in this zone here, but as part of the design, we'll obviously be thinking of the other future areas as well and how they will connect together. I also know that there's going to be a connection road which runs through this area and links together the future neighbourhoods. Some of the other things I obviously consider at this stage is any other inputs from other consultants, or I guess constraints or things that we need to be aware of, and make sure that we map them in from the start. So in this particular instance, this creek, whilst it provides a really lovely setting for the neighbourhood, it's also potentially a bushfire threat. So there's a requirement to have a perimeter road which is running along here and a secondary sort of linkage point in there. So we need to have 2 points in and out from a bushfire safety point of view. I also know somewhere within here we want to create an active open space area, kind of kick and throw. And my initial thoughts is if we located it somewhere in this zone, it would link in with the bushland and potential linear open space. So it ties together as part of a open space network, and it also starts to create opportunities to tie these different parts together so that the existing vegetation can tie in with the kick and throw area and the linear open space. Once I've got those very basic first principles set up, I just start to investigate different sketch options over the top. The idea is to keep it pretty loose, but you'll note down in this corner that I've also got a scale. So I'm always continually making sure that things are roughly to scale. So I know that when I take it into the computer and start to work it up in detail, that I know it will work. There's no point sketching all these things that look kind of good, but then once you actually get into designing them in detail, they don't obviously work out. So the process that I use for just sketching up options, I guess, has come out of using butter paper in the past. So I just create extra layers, just get a lighter sort of pen, and then start to sketch different options over the top of this. So this site being in the southern hemisphere, the preferred orientation of north is straight up the page here. So the first obvious opportunity that I can see here is that having that northern orientation and this existing stand of trees that we're trying to retain, there's the opportunity to have some smaller type of lots in this location, which have the dual frontage to both parts of open space, but they could have their private open space or a courtyard on the northern side here, so they'll get plenty of light in. And that allows us to have a narrower townhouse type of product, but make sure that the solar orientation and the amenity of looking onto something is designed in from the start. One of the things I personally like to do is when I'm sketching at this level is I always try to have some inspiration sort of images of the type of built form or landscape that I'm trying to incorporate into the design just on hand. I just use it as a reference. So when I'm designing something up, I'm looking at these and thinking about how those interfaces might work, but they also become a reference that once I work up a concept, I can show these to the client to help them to understand the design ideas that I'm trying to suggest. It's a very basic approach, but it just works well in the early phases of the design. From here, I just start to look at different options in terms of built form, wrapping around this space, different orientations, linkages out to the open space, how they might work, key pathway linkages through the open space and tying it into the residential, and then also how future linkages might work into other residential precincts. And whilst it's really quite loose, it's a really important part of the design process, because this sketching of the ideas sets up the first principles that end up being carried through the design evolution. And from here, it's really just starting to work up different options and areas in a bit more detail, layering one idea over the next and testing different options until you find a preferred direction. But the focus should always be on establishing the principles and testing ideas, rather than trying to reach the end solution and final details. It should be on the thinking rather than the drawing. Because in the end, that's what design is all about. It's not how good you can draw, it's how good your ideas are.